Hello painting students. I wanted to give you a clear video demo of glazing today, just because it's one of the main painting techniques that I want you all to feel comfortable with. Glazing is the translucent application of paint where it's thinned out, and so oftentimes glazing works best when there's already an underpainting set up. So we've got this flower rendering over here, and I've got some yellow that I've thinned out with walnut oil. And I'm going to see if I've thinned it to the right level to glaze and tint all of this part of the flower more yellow. So what this tells me is that there might be a little too much pigment in my glaze, and so I'm gonna get a little more walnut oil. With glazes, you need to find the balance between it's affecting the underpainting underneath enough, but that it's not so thick that it is just completely repainting it. So there was that kind of fuzzy texture in this area that I was hoping the yellow paint would pick up, and it does to some extent. With glazing, it can be really easy not to do enough, and it can also be really easy to put too much where it just obliterates the form. Let me show another area. So I've thinned out a little bit of yellow with the walnut oil. I'm gonna hit these petals that I didn't hit on the last demo. And so you can see here as I'm glazing over this shadow, the shadow's still there. It just shifts everything. So glazes tend to diminish the brightest highlights of the underpainting underneath it. Glazes tend to diminish the darkest darks. It tends to bring kind of everything to the mid values. And you can control glazes quite a bit. You can wipe them off to subdue them. Sometimes the painting just needs a tint. As you can see, it's just kind of tinted yellow now. And I find glazes to be very effective with figure painting, especially because skin is actually made up of translucent layers. And so the most realistic flesh tones are the ones that you actually can glaze some of that flesh tone color in. So now I'm repainting. So right now I'm glazing in oil paint. You can glaze in acrylic, but you have considerably less time to do so. It's kind of a one shot and done. If it didn't do what you wanted it to do, you are kind of stuck with it. With oil paint, after this entire session, I can go in with a Gamma Sol soaked rag and actually take off all of this paint and try something else. So that is one benefit of oil over acrylic when it comes to glazing. There's different mixtures you can use for oil paint glazing. When I am just working with painting, I want to stay primarily matte, I'll just use walnut oil because it doesn't dry too shiny or anything. So I'm just kind of quickly glazing the rest of these petals, and then the last thing I'm going to do is glaze some black in to darken the background and to get the center of this flower. One thing to keep in mind with glazes is you always want to glaze darker if you can, meaning avoid adding white to glazes. The lighter you glaze, and if there's white inclusions in a glaze, it can tend to look kind of filmy. And so glazes look most believable as a thin application of color when you're going a little darker. Somehow this yellow still works even though it's a bright value, but it gets pretty thinned out. So I've glazed some of these petals with the yellow. And oftentimes you want to call it. As soon as your brush goes on, you should make the decision, is this glaze too thin? Is it too thick? Is it the right color? Because you can stop at that point. All right, so then the next thing I'm going to do is glaze some black by thinning some black with the walnut oil. And because there's no information in the center of this flower, the glaze looks awful. Because there's no information for it to pick up, so it's just black. So I'm gonna take that off actually for now, because I don't like how that looks. So then let's see about taking some of this black and last thing I'm gonna show you is how we might begin to thin out a little bit of this black. So say the whole background would shift to black. The last thing I want to show you is just a little bit more fine-tune application of glazing. And so once these values are introduced, and just for the sake of time on this demo, I'm not going to do the entire thing. Oops, yeah. Ignore this. But I just want to show down at the bottom here that if we thin out some black paint, now that it's introduced into the color scheme, if you wanted to carefully glaze small moments of these petals, to shove them back in space, the thin application of paint can be very useful for fine-tuned moments like that. And again, you're working with the form. I could pull this black glaze over the entire petal and you'd still see a bit of that form. So those are just a couple applications of glazing kind of overall, and then you can do it in smaller areas as well. And glazing really just means you're thinning out the paint, so it's a translucent application.